Biological Riley presents Is The Last of Us Part 1 Worth $70? The Last of Us was an instant classic back when it released in 2013. As a top-shelf video game experience, this Naughty Dog-developed PlayStation 3 exclusive was the perfect marriage of story and gameplay where you play as Joel, a grizzled and violent middle-aged man, as he transports a near-teenage girl named Ellie across a post-apocalyptic American wasteland that has been ravaged by infected. Basically zombies, but with more creative flair. The infected are infected by a spore-like fungus that overrides the victim's identity and free will and turns them into horrid, mutated, simple-minded creatures who desire to infect others and spread their fungus, because poison mushrooms, because zombie fungi. It's a problem. But to make matters worse, the infected aren't the only threat that Joel and Ellie must contend with. In fact, the duo run into other human survivors, and since this is a very bleak interpretation about humanity's demise and societal decline, those said survivors are generally killers, murderers, and other words that are synonymous with killers and murderers. Words that can be found in the Grimdark Dictionary if I was fuckered to find them. But whether we are discussing the infected or the survivors, i.e. The Last of Us within The Last of Us, Joel and Ellie go on a harrowing journey where they must combat these hostiles, which when playing the game means an assortment of well-crafted stealth-action horror gameplay sequences ranging from sneaking past enemies, to taking enemy combatants out silently, to engaging in firefights, and all the way to participating in white-knuckle action set pieces. In other words, there's a lot of grueling combat in this game. Combat that is ultimately intertwined with the story. Beyond just being complementary, the gameplay enhances The Last of Us' stellar story, to which the game's story then reciprocates back to the gameplay. For one example, let's discuss the terrific writing. Through the character interactions, the actor performances, and the well-written dialogue, the player begins to feel the strength of Joel's emotional paternal bond with Ellie, something that translates into the gameplay because due to Joel's new role as Ellie's mass murdering guardian, we the player feel protective of Ellie as well. Like Joel, we want to keep her safe from this dangerous world. We the player care for her too. Another example of how The Last of Us story and gameplay complement each other is in regards to the title setting itself. Tonally speaking, the game is dark, gritty, and filthy. It's a nihilistic world bereft of hope, similar to the atmosphere of a Chicago Bears game. It is a cutthroat fable filled with violent people who have committed unforgivable actions, and our main protagonist Joel is one of these people. And seeing as we play as this character, the player eventually becomes complicit in Joel's actions. We become active participants when Joel commits moderate to severe human rights violations. By playing as Joel, we actively make violent contributions to this already downcast and violent world. And with this example and many others, The Last of Us's gameplay overall enhances the story. A story of which that can only work in a video game medium due to how the player actively interacts with the story. And due to this, The Last of Us was a watershed moment for gaming back when it released in 2013. It was AAA gaming's pinnacle narrative achievement of that era, arguably even more so than BioShock or Dark Sector. Remember Dark Sector? I don't really. I just pulled a game out of my ass to use as the butt of the joke here. And that game unfortunately turned out to be Dark Sector. But regardless, The Last of Us was and still is a top-tier video game experience. It's among the best games of its type, as well as being among my own favorite video games of all time, because you know, it's The Last of Us. This brings us to today's topic, which is The Last of Us Part 1, i.e. the recently released remake of The Last of Us that was recently released onto the PlayStation 5. And to be more specific, this video covers whether or not this remake was necessary, as well as whether or not it is worth a steep $70 asking price, because while The Last of Us is one of AAA narrative gaming's crown jewels, was a remake of the title really even needed? After all, the original game isn't even a decade old yet. It's not even in middle school. It doesn't know the purpose of tampons yet. Yet Sony still saw fit to give The Last of Us the remake treatment, because money. So with that, we have to ask, was a remake of a 9-year-old game needed? And if it was, then is it worth today's full AAA asking price? And to answer these questions, it's surprisingly complicated. While sure, it's tempting to say that The Last of Us Part 1 isn't necessary, and that no, it's not worth $70, there's actually a more substantive explanation here, rather than a more clear-cut yes or no. The answer is a bit more layered than you think. Like cakes or ogres, there's a good argument to make on both sides of the fence here. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of this video essay, let's start by describing what type of remake The Last of Us Part 1 is. See, there are different types of video game remakes. Some are very faithfully updated recreations of the original games, like the Crash Bandicoot and Sane Trilogy, and some titles are stylistically basically new games that take a fresh spin on the classic originals they're based on, a la the Resident Evil 2 remake and Final Fantasy VII Remake. We'll talk more about these shortly. But The Last of Us Part 1 is a different beast entirely. In fact, the developers at Naughty Dog and PlayStation Studios faithfully rebuilt this game from the ground up. Rather than giving the series the remaster treatment like how Naughty Dog did with The Last of Us' PlayStation 4 remaster back in 2014, The Last of Us Part 1 was for the most part remade in order to more or less craft a technologically updated version of the same game, meaning that the level design, the story beats, and the vocal performances present in the original game are virtually unchanged here. Hell, the voiceover work and the music are from the same audio files as the original. A lot of it is basically the same. Instead, the developers used the original version as a guide in order to incorporate new changes, all while having The Last of Us Part 1 remain true to the classic 2013 title, essentially making The Last of Us Part 1 more or less a similar game to the original, but with a fresh coat of paint and notable quality of life improvements. And the most notable of these changes was in the visual department. The facial animations have been modernized compared to the stilted PlayStation 3 animations from previous incarnations, the environments are more detailed and colors pop more, and the lighting is more realistic and cinematic. Visually speaking, The Last of Us Part 1 is a dramatic upgrade. It's like comparing a soggy Whopper with a pristine and juicy Culver's Deluxe. It's markedly different. Visually speaking, the game is a notable upgrade. However, the gameplay differences aren't as noteworthy. Unlike the visuals, the gameplay only has some modest alterations. Some of the environments are more destructible, the DualSense adaptive triggers add a bit of a new dimension to the gunplay, and the AI has been improved. In fact, enemy AI will actually perform flanking maneuvers, and companion AI won't run out into the open while you are in stealth as much, which in the original was a problem and was always shocking, because the enemies never really reacted when a character like Ellie walked right in front of them, also to the point that you might have wondered whether or not Ellie was Sixth Sense. Was she a ghost the whole time? But yeah, joking aside, in The Last of Us Part 1, companion AI don't behave like they're invisible half the time, meaning that the game won't break your immersion, just like how women supposedly don't break wind, because obviously it's something that never happens. It's what I've been told all my life. With that said though, The Last of Us Part 1's most noteworthy gameplay difference is its vast wealth of accessibility options. See, the original version of The Last of Us wasn't the most disability friendly. In fact, for many folks with disabilities, the game was virtually unplayable. Hell, The Last of Us may as well have been Superman 64, because for those with disabilities, neither of these titles were fucking playable. But this has changed with The Last of Us Part 1. There are audio descriptions for cinematics, alternative controls, presets for those who are audio or visually impaired, there are visual aids, motion sickness options, text-to-speech and audio cues, and more. And honestly, it's wonderful. And while sure The Last of Us Part 1's accessibility does have some faults, I'm honestly deferring to the expertise of Can I Play That's Ben Bayless here. They did a great review on the game's accessibility features a little more than a month and a half back. The Last of Us Part 1 is now playable for many folks with disabilities, which makes the game a marked improvement over the original in this regard. It is a terrific development. The Last of Us Part 1 is worthy of being labeled as a remake. Whether we are discussing the new and improved visuals, the slight gameplay enhancements, or the scale of the accessibility options, this game qualifies as a remake, and one that truly amplifies the original title's terrific qualities. Hell, if anything, the game's developers believe that this new incarnation of the title is closer to their creative vision compared to the original, mostly because the OG The Last of Us had to deal with technological constraints, like the lack of fidelity in facial animations, the absence of dynamic lighting, and just more or less having to deal with the restrictions of a PlayStation 3 behemoth that was towards the end of its lifespan. And due to these reasons, as well as many others, the original version of The Last of Us was held back by the technological limitations of the time. Technological limitations that no longer exist in gaming's modern era, meaning that when remaking The Last of Us, the developers could finally fulfill their creative vision that had previously been restricted, ultimately ensuring that The Last of Us Part 1 is now the definitive version of this classic narrative adventure. And honestly speaking, the remake made a great game greater. But with that being said, it's worth asking whether or not the remake's treatment was necessary here, because while yes, the technological improvements of the past decade did ensure that this version of the game would be closer to the way in which the developers originally envisioned the story, the same argument could be said about many other stories in modern media as well. After all, creatives have struggled with budgetary or technological restrictions in the past in order to create a given movie, TV show, game, or etc., and had to compromise their overall creative vision on some level in order to release the end product. Because that's what's called art through adversity, i.e. creating art even despite how there are limitations preventing a given project's creative vision, which is honestly something that can be ascribed to some great works like the original Halloween movie and the first Rocky, as well as really terrible stories like the most recent adaptation of Cats, because obviously CGI cat as technology was not the main problem of that film. It was bad for other reasons. But whether good or bad, movies and other stories from adjacent mediums usually succeed or fail as creative works due to the prowess of the directors, actors, developers, and etc. behind them, rather than just these monetary or technological restrictions alone. It's about working with what you got, which is honestly how I feel about my body. And with that, the hurdles in the creative process generally don't necessitate a whole updated remake or creative rejiggering of an original story, especially on such short notice. These movies or games generally don't require a remake or an alternate version less than 10 years after their initial release. And in terms of movies specifically, this includes the concept of director's cuts as well, which in general are unnecessary and add little to the overall experience. Though of course there are some exceptions when a studio heavily meddles with the original cut of something like Blade Runner. But once again, that's the exception rather than the rule. Kind of like my view of Death of the Author. It's a case-by-case basis sort of thing. But regardless, most alternate editions and remakes aren't exactly necessary, even if the original work was crafted under the constraints of a budget and or technology of the time. Hell, it is even possible that these limitations made those stories better, as seen with the original Star Wars trilogy in comparison to the 90s special editions. See, the original Star Wars trilogy wasn't 100% in line with creator George Lucas's creative vision. There were a few shots that he was not satisfied with when originally making the movies. He desired to add more science fiction elements on screen, and he aimed to more or less modernize the trilogy in a way that couldn't be done back in the 70s and the 80s with those aforementioned budgetary and technological limitations. And with the special editions, Lucas was able to go to town and make additions to these films that were either closer to how he originally envisioned the trilogy or were closer to how he wanted the movies to be 2 decades after the fact. But here is the thing, the original cuts of the Star Wars trilogy were and are superior. In fact, the originals clearly did more with less. Clearly. Because honestly, the deviations in the 90s special editions honestly made these movies worse, even though they were closer to the versions that George Lucas originally envisioned. A lot of these changes would have been better left on the cutting room floor. They were just not needed. And similarly, other re-edits, alternate versions, director's cuts, or even short-term remakes generally don't justify their own existences. Hell, even when they're good and are complementary to the old experiences, they aren't exactly necessary. And honestly, that's also true for The Last of Us Part 1. It is undeniably a great remake that makes good use of more modern game development tools, but it's still technically unnecessary. Like Taco Bell's menu, it arguably doesn't need to exist. This is especially true when taking the popularity of video game remakes into account. See, by now, it's no secret that remaking classic video games has become profitable on both the development and the publishing end. After all, games like the aforementioned Crash Bandicoot and Sane trilogy, Resident Evil 2 Remake, and Final Fantasy VII Remake were incredibly popular both in terms of critical appraisal and monetary success, proving that remakes can win over audiences and justify their existences. But the same argument doesn't necessarily work on The Last of Us Part 1, mostly because the original versions of Resident Evil 2, Final Fantasy VII, and the first 3 Crash Bandicoot games were released in the 90s on consoles like the PlayStation 1, whereas the original The Last of Us was released at the tail end of the PlayStation 3's life cycle back in 2013, meaning that the remakes of the older games like RE2, Final Fantasy VII, and Crash Bandicoot were far more justified. After all, the technology behind those original games was far more outdated, and due to that distance in time and technology, these remakes breathed new modernized life into these classic properties. With a remake like the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy, the visual upgrade was dramatic enough to warrant the remake treatment, because obviously PlayStation 4 graphics and technology is a major upgrade compared to that of the hardware of the PlayStation 1. And with the remakes of titles like Resident Evil Evil 2 and Final Fantasy VII, the visuals weren't the only items that were overhauled. In fact, the gameplay in both of these remakes were modernized as well. In terms of Resident Evil 2 Remake, the developers added an over-the-shoulder camera and updated the combat compared to the fixed camera and blocky controls of the original. And in terms of Final Fantasy VII Remake, the turn-based strategy elements were akin to that of a more recent Final Fantasy game. The action is ongoing rather than stop and go. The turn-based strategy gameplay received a modernized makeover, which is honestly something that can be said about the game's story as well. In fact, let's be blunt, the remake actually enhanced Final Fantasy VII's narrative due to how it is packaged with brand new text and subtext and had some very interesting meta commentary about the nature of video game remakes. Sure, the story retreaded many familiar plot points and reintroduces the player to some classic characters, but the game has a whole meta-narrative about how if the developers made any deviation to the text of the sacred classic, it could be construed as a form of cultural heresy. And due to this, Final Fantasy VII Remake was a wholly new experience, even though it is technically a remake. In other words, the remake really added to the story here, which is really impressive seeing as we are talking about Final Fantasy fucking VII. It proved that remakes can be justified. Ultimately, the remakes of Crash, Resi 2, and Final Fantasy VII were all high-quality titles that felt like brand new experiences. They didn't feel like the same game, but with prettier graphics and a modicum of updates. They were fresh, like Nathan Drake selling us Subway sandwiches, because that sure happened, but sadly I cannot say the same about The Last of Us Part 1. Well, not the Subway sandwiches bit, because Joel and the rest of the characters in that game attempting to sell me a Subway sandwich would weird the fuck out of me. Like, David, what type of meat is in the meatball marinara? David, but instead I'm referring to The Last of Us Part 1 as a remake, because while sure this remake is definitely the best version of The Last of Us, it isn't a game that dramatically transforms the original. After all, the 9-year technology and time gap just isn't large enough to make this new incarnation feel like that major of an overhaul compared to the original. If anything, the game is just a nice enhancement rather than something wholly new. Like, it wouldn't be the same if The Last of Us was 20 years old instead of 9. Hell, the situation would have been different if Naughty Dog did a remake of the first Uncharted title like they originally desired to, which was a game that released incredibly early during the PlayStation 3's life cycle and was honestly janky as fuck. Like with Uncharted, you can tell that it was Naughty Dog's baby's first action-adventure game. It had clunky controls, a lot of the action in the first 2/3 of the game plays like a run-of-the-mill third-person shooter, and the player doesn't really gain much control over Nathan Drake during what otherwise could have been some amazing action set pieces, and due to this, the game was rough, and honestly it could have easily benefited from the remake treatment. If anything, a modernized Uncharted 1 would be a dramatic transformation. It would be like me before and after estradiol. Hashtag give Uncharted estrogen. But 2013's The Last of Us did not necessitate such change. With the game, Naughty Dog was much more confident and had a trio of Uncharted titles under its belt. The Last of Us exuded high craftsmanship, and it was already basically perfect. And for that reason, a remake of the game doesn't need to exist. Even with its technical improvements, The Last of Us Part 1 isn't exactly necessary, unless of course you couldn't play the original due to its lack of accessibility features. Then the remake is worthwhile in that regard. But for everything else, I'd argue that The Last of Us Part 1 didn't really need to be made. It is unnecessary, though likely not as pointless as the upcoming Horizon Zero Dawn remake, a game that came out in fucking 2017. But still, The Last of Us Part 1 was needless nonetheless. But with that being said, there is a difference between unnecessary and unwanted, because while The Last of Us Part 1 was unneeded, it wasn't necessarily undesirable. Even though yes, The Last of Us Part 1 sales aren't exactly through the roof, they're solid but not spectacular, and the remake of a 9-year-old game that can already be played on the PlayStation 5 was far removed from being an obligatory purchase, there is still value here. There are still reasons to play it. After all, The Last of Us Part 1 is still the best version of a great game, and personally, I had a good time with it. It was cool to replay a version of this classic adventure that had more in-depth facial animations and visuals. It was fun to play this updated version of the game, the version that was more in line with Naughty Dog's creative vision, and for this reason, it's difficult for me to say whether or not The Last of Us should have been remade or that it should cost $70. Because logically, yes, a 9-year-old game shouldn't be remade and sold at a full modern AAA price point. But here is the thing, if I were to solely use that rationale as my stance on this topic, I'd be a major hypocrite, because ultimately I still bought the game. I paid full price for it, and while I might joke around and say I played it just so I could cover it for the channel, the truth is I have free will. I go where I choose, which means I want to go to Wendy's. God, I'm still so hungry. And in terms of The Last of Us Part 1, I wanted to buy it. As stated before, The Last of Us is one of my favorite games of all time, and I will utilize any excuse necessary in order to play it again, even if that means spending $70 on a remake of a 9-year-old game, because apparently that's the type of person I am. And ultimately, the decision of whether or not The Last of Us Part 1 is worth the asking price will vary depending on a person-by-person basis, because on the most fundamental level, it all depends on what type of customer you are. Some people will play it because it's more accessible. New players may enjoy it for the first time after watching the upcoming HBO Max adaptation, and longtime players like myself might just use any excuse necessary to dive back into this game and its world, because truly whether or not The Last of Us Part 1 is worth its asking price is entirely up to you. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you think of The Last of Us Part 1. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto my Discord server, and $5 a month allows you to start making review requests. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patron, particularly my high tier ones in David, Samantha, Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.